All right. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges is the former commander of U.S. Army Europe, and he joins me now from Poland. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Dana. How are you?
Sir, good to talk to you again. Is Russia the first nation in history to announce a series of annexations while its troops are in reverse and retreating?
That's quite a combination. It certainly has got to be humiliating almost, or at least embarrassing for the Kremlin to have this happening, and to watch the public commentators try to explain what's going on to the public. But I think that increasingly, two very important social things are happening. Number one, nobody in Europe, I mean, not even some of the most hardcore Kremlin verstehers, as Germans call them, sympathizers, are acknowledging that these referenda are legitimate, or that the annexations are legal. Nobody. I mean, even the Secretary General of the United Nations, who has not been especially tough, even he came out immediately and said these are absolutely not legal. So that's an important change in the political and social dynamic from the West. And then inside Russia, it seems to me that increasingly the population is they're no longer concealing their unhappiness or disagreement. It's coming out more and more in the open in different ways, and I think this will be an important thing to watch.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And as somebody who watches social media and watches media, mainstream media in Russia, I mean, it is startling, I think, what's been happening in the last week, where you see a lot of these commentators coming on nightly television now and acknowledging problems, acknowledging the fact that they have had to retreat from Lyman, for instance, and the large areas of Kherson, trying to put some positive spin on it, that they're going to, get these 300,000 new draftees in there, and that will somehow change the situation. But there does seem to be genuine panic and alarm that this war is not going the way that they were told originally it would easily go.
Yeah, that's important. The even within that mafia sort of system of government that they have there still has to be some degree of trust. Some people, have to be able to count, even if they assume that there is a percentage of misinformation or incompetence or whatever. And so the depth of the corruption and the depth of the deception is, I think people are starting to come to grips with that, because then you start worrying about, well, what else is my government covering up? I mean, how unsafe are these nuclear power plants? How unsafe is our water? How unsafe is, whatever. And so I think, I think you and I have talked about this before. We could be looking at the front end of the collapse of the Russian Federation. I'm not advocating for that, but I do advocate that we need to be prepared for it. And a lot can happen over the next several months internally within Russia when you combine the battlefield losses, which seem to really be piling up now, this atrocious and poorly managed mobilization effort, the tens of thousands of military-age males that have departed Russia, and then the impact of sanctions it's having on the domestic side, not just on the defense industry. There's a lot of forces at work here, a lot of centrifugal forces that could but could launch some of these ethnic republics.
Do you think that the Russian front line is going through what appears to be almost a complete collapse in areas?
I think we know from history that sometimes when you have a massive penetration, a breakthrough of some sort, psychologically, it can have a devastating effect, especially if you're talking about soldiers that are not disciplined or trained. I mean, well-trained, confident units don't worry too much about when the enemy gets to your rear, because you know that somebody else will take care of it and you're going to stay and do your job. When you're not disciplined and you don't have confidence about who's around you or behind you, it can very quickly turn into a panic. And so that's how these collapses can occur. I don't know for sure that that's going to happen, but it has that kind of feeling. And you have to wonder, inside the Russian formations, the will to fight, would they rather surrender or would they rather get out of there? And I think we'll probably see a combination of all three of those in the Kharkiv Donetsk Oblast, in Kherson, and then of course, all roads lead to Crimea.
So talk to me about Crimea, because I know you've been quoted by other people as saying that you think the Ukrainians will not only go after Crimea, that a lot of people need to remember that was annexed illegally according to the international community in 2014. Not only will they go after it, but you think they will win, the Ukrainians will win Crimea, the home of Putin's Black Sea Fleet.
Well, the Black Sea Fleet has been underwhelming, certainly below what I had expected before this all started. And, they're hugging the coastline there of Crimea under the protection of Russian air defense because they're so worried about Ukrainian anti-ship missiles. And Ukraine didn't even have a navy, but yet the Black Sea Fleet is not contributing. Their submarines, I have seen reports that their subs relocated from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, the Russian Navy base on the mainland on the other side of Kerch Straits. I do believe that as this counteroffensive continues to make progress, particularly after they finally do eliminate this Kherson pocket, which I think is going to happen probably. It's hard to say. This is a pretty significant force, but they're trapped. So it'll take some time, but eventually when that's gone, now you've got coming from the west and from the north, headed towards Crimea, when they're able to bring their HIMARS and other rocket launchers forward, and you start hitting Russian bases in Crimea with rockets on a daily basis, then I think Crimea becomes untenable for the Russian Air Force and the logistics and those things. And then I think it's a matter of time.
Talk to me about these ATACMS that people speak about. These are essentially launched, as I understand it, from the same platform as the HIMARS, but they are much longer in range. And you believe that the U.S. administration, which up until now has not given them to Ukraine, should just get on with it and give them to the Ukrainian army?
Yeah, ATACMS, great Army acronym. I can't remember what all it stands for, but it's a rocket that has a range of about 300 kilometers. So same launcher, the HIMARS truck, and the configuration now, it has a 6-pack on the back, 6 Gimlers, GMLRS rockets that have the range of out to about what's that, 100, a little over 100 kilometers, around 100 kilometers. ATACMS more than 3 times that range, but there's only one ATACMS rocket that's fired at a time. It's not in a 6-pack. It's a bigger round, obviously. That would be good because its straight line distance from Odessa to Sevastopol is 300 kilometers. So they could already be hitting these critical logistics hubs and air bases in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine if they had ATACMS. Now, of course, the administration is concerned that if the Ukrainians had ATACMS, that they would use them against Russian air bases in Belgorod and, inside Russia proper or inside Belarus. And I can understand their concern because that, they've been concerned all along that something might finally cause Russia to escalate to a nuclear weapon or something like that. I think, frankly, if the Russians are murdering Ukrainian civilians with missiles that are flying out of Russia, then those are legitimate targets. But I think the Ukrainians have said, look, if you give us ATACMS, we won't shoot them into Russia. I mean, that would be an easy thing for the U.S. to control. So I think it's this is one of the very few areas where I disagree with the administration's approach to this war.
You just made me look it up, sir. It's the Army Tactical Missile System.
I'm impressed.
No, I looked it up. I didn't know. I couldn't remember what the acronym is for either. When you talk about the nuclear threat from Russia, you and I have spoken about this before. And you know, there's been an evolution here since February, where originally NATO countries don't really want to speak about it too much because they don't want to give it too much credence. But increasingly, with the rhetoric that's coming out of Russia, you know, these nuclear threats are being taken more seriously, and the possibility of a tactical weapon being used somewhere by Russia, whether it be on the battlefield or whether it be a demonstration detonation in the Black Sea or elsewhere, is being more and more likely. Now, the administration, forgive me for the long question, but the administration says that they have warned Russia, most recently, even in the last week or so, do not detonate a tactical nuclear missile. But they continue to use the language that they would respond with an overwhelming conventional attack. Do you think, and people will look back on this, do you think that the Biden administration is being tough enough in their language with Russia, properly warning them of consequences if they deploy a tactical nuclear missile somewhere?
So, first of all, I think the administration has been very clear. President Biden said it on TV. Jeremy Farland has said it. And I would expect that there have been multiple communications, parallel, behind the scenes, different interlocutors to various people in the Kremlin. There's no mistake that they know that the United States has said, do not use a nuclear weapon of any type. If you do, the response will be devastating. It will change the face of the war for Russia, which is what President Biden said. So,
as somebody, as a military insider, as somebody who has been in planning, both in America and then in NATO and Europe, what do you think they mean by devastating?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. The key is, do the Russians believe it, that we would actually do it? There's no doubt they've been told. There's no doubt that they've been told. And I would also bet that the Chinese have communicated to them and say, this is a terrible, I do not even think about doing that. So I imagine that the Kremlin's getting all kinds of pressure on this. The key is, do they really believe that we would do something that would be so devastating? Now, what does devastating mean? I would expect that the Pentagon and the National Security Staff have drawn up a list of options for the president. A full range of everything from an angry email to total destruction and everything in between. And there could be a combination of economic factors, kinetic, non-kinetic, nuclear, non-nuclear, any sort of a combination that would be based on probably what did the Russians do? So proportional, because this would also, I feel confident, would be done in consultation with our allies, because our allies would have to deal with the consequences as well. Now, the U.S. won't ask permission to do it, but I think this administration has done a good job of consulting with allies. So that's one thing. Proportional. Also, do it in a way that does not automatically lead to escalation. So in other words, unlikely that a response would involve a strike inside the motherland, Russia, unless the nuclear weapon the Russians used came from there. So looking for ways to contain it, but being damaging enough that it was clear that, you know, there's a lot more where this came from. Do not do that again. I think, you know, if I was to bet, I would think a non-nuclear response would be more likely than a nuclear response. And there's so many things that could be done, whether it was to Black Sea Fleet or ground forces, stuff inside Ukraine or in the Black Sea.
Your old boss, General Petraeus, was interviewed. Your old boss, when you were in the 101st Airborne, I mean, was interviewed, and he talked about just some of the things you mentioned. And you know, they would destroy Russian troops in Ukraine. They would destroy the Black Sea Fleet. It was interesting to when the discussion turned to, is this an Article 5 situation? Now, obviously, it's not an Article 5 situation because Ukraine is not in NATO. But if there are radioactive clouds blowing over Europe, is that an Article 5 situation?
So keep in mind, and I know you know this, but maybe not all your viewers do, um, there's nothing automatic about Article 5. You know, it's not a laser beam like you walk through it and the door opens up. It's not that kind. There's no triggering of Article 5. It is at the end of the day a political decision where typically a nation would go to the North Atlantic Council and say, you know, this has happened. We believe that this is an armed attack on us, and therefore, under the Washington Treaty, should be considered an armed attack on all. So, you know, the alliance has, for example, has evolved to the point where certain types of cyber attacks could be considered an armed attack. And certainly, I would expect if there was a nuclear strike that led to nuclear fallout on a NATO country. I mean, it could be that a nation, whether it was Poland or Lithuania or Romania, whoever it was that was affected by it, could go to the North Atlantic Council and say, this is clearly an armed attack on us, because the Russians would have known exactly what the downwind prediction would be for this type of weapon, air burst, ground burst, prevailing winds. They would know that. I mean, we practiced that when I was a lieutenant. You knew how to do a downwind prediction. And then do the nations agree that, and let's say, even if all 30 nations agree that, yes, that was an armed attack, and therefore we consider armed attack on us, they're still not compelled to have to do something about it. So I don't know if there's value in that, but the ambiguity is important. The Russians should be thinking, if we do something that produces a fallout downwind that affects a NATO country, they should be very worried that now they've got 30 nations are going to get involved.
And as you mentioned before, it's circumstance based. It really depends what, where, and who's affected.
But there is no doubt in my mind that the U.S. will have to respond because China, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, other countries that have nuclear weapons will be watching how we respond. Do we respond? So this is about more than just a nuclear weapon that might possibly be utilized inside Ukraine.
General Hodges, you're always generous with your time, so I'll make this the last question, and I appreciate it very much. The speech that President Putin made on Friday when he announced the annexation of these 4 regions in Ukraine, I mean, I was struck by suddenly this guy who was railed on about denazifying Ukraine, didn't even mention Nazis, really. He's railed on about the NATO threat. We didn't really go on about NATO very much at all. Suddenly now he's just talked about the moral vacuum of liberal democracies. He's called us all, satanic, Western, democratic, liberal leading countries. There seems to be, I mean, a declaration on the West. And it's hard to put your finger on exactly what is driving Putin and this war anymore.
Well, it certainly is not a legitimate concern about a threat to Russia's territorial integrity. I mean, the safest part of Russia has always been the part that touched NATO, and now that part is going to grow because he's driven Finland and Sweden into, particularly Finland, which touches Russia, into joining the alliance. So I can't fully articulate what it is that motivates him, other than this illusion of trying to bring back what Peter the Great had, and this empire, this very nationalistic sense of entitlement almost. I think that he does seem very disconnected from reality. And I don't know if that's just because he's disconnected, people below him are scared to tell him the truth, or he refuses to believe what we all see. For me, the key is the people around him. He cannot launch a nuclear weapon by himself. And while I think he is evil, I don't think he's crazy. I don't think he's suicidal. and I don't think the people around him are suicidal. And so the object of our information efforts should be those people around him saying, look, if you have any shred of hope that you think you might be able to get back to some sort of normalcy after all this is over in the post-Putin era, and you will make sure he does not attempt to use a nuclear weapon. Because if he does, then all of you will be held accountable as well. And your families will never have a chance to get back in your apartment in Belgravia or send your kid to school somewhere and all your yachts, all that stuff. You'll have zero future. There are zero positive upsides for Russia to use a nuclear weapon. And so I think, and I suspect that those kinds of communications are going on now.
Ben Hodges, great to talk to you, sir.
Thank you for the privilege, Dana.